language of the unheard. In a speech titled The Other America in 1967, civil rights leader Martin Luther King condemned the riots of the time as socially destructive. But he warned that a riot is the language of the unheard.
But riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met.
The iconic civil rights visionary warned that as America postponed justice, the country could only expect recurrences of violence and riots. More than half a century later, America is still gripped by unprecedented level of racial injustice and violence. Americans around the country are protesting the death of George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man who died after a white police officer knelt on his neck for more than 8 minutes late last month.
There will be no peace until there is justice. It's another very simple chant from the streets, but it's as fitting today as it has ever been. No justice, no peace. And it's not even a threat. It's a simple statement of an equation. You cannot escape this. They've tried, and they've succeeded largely with periods of peace, periods of cooperation, reform. Now all that reform has been rolled back, and it is down to tear gas in the streets.
Floyd's death has revived the debate about being black in America. The unrest unfolding across the country is against a backdrop of depression, deprivation, and deep inequality.
We just want people to hold each other accountable for their actions, especially when it comes to race, because it is a long fight. We're in this for the long haul. It's not something that will end tomorrow or the next day or the next day. It's something that's been ingrained in our society for 400 plus years, and it's something that we are changing gradually every single day.
The sheer scale of the protests, breaking curfews and defying National Guard troops, suggests that Floyd's death is already proving a defining moment in America's racial politics.
They rejected him for jobs. They rejected him for positions. They rejected him to play certain teams. God took the rejected stone and made him the cornerstone of a movement that's going to change the whole wide world.
Could this be a turning point in the fight against racism in America?
I think it already is a defining moment in that people have been fed up for a very long time. And this just blew, partly because it was just, obviously it results from the death of George Floyd. But if you follow these demonstrations from state to state, they will preface their own history. George Floyd was killed in May. Someone else in Texas or California or Minneapolis was killed in February or January. Or it's an epidemic. Speak of a pandemic. This is the pandemic no one wants to talk about, the murder of black citizens by the U.S. police forces.
The pandemic has taken many black lives. The list keeps growing. Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Walter Scott, and now George Floyd have been the most high-profile cases of police killings in recent years. These names have become synonymous with racial injustice in America. Video footage in the cases of Garner, Scott, and Floyd revealed to the world the unconscionable brutality with which their lives were stolen from them.
I stand in solidarity with this family because it mimics my case, and this is personal to me. They have doubled back and claimed another life by a chokehold. That's why we have to fight for justice.
Yes, ma'am.
This family is hurting now, just like I'm hurting. My hurt don't go away. So that's why I know what they are feeling.
President Trump has dismissed the nationwide protesters as lawless rioters and anarchists who should be removed from the streets by force.
In America, justice is never achieved at the hands of an angry mob. I will not allow angry mobs to dominate.
That characterization only misses the bigger picture. It's a misrepresentation of what has been a mass expression of revulsion and fury. The protests highlight centuries of social, political, and economic oppression of African Americans. Protesters have pulled down statues of slave traders and Confederate soldiers, which they believe represent a sad past in U.S. history. Some white people acknowledge that they also need to step up and fight for racial equality in America.
I just think that it's our responsibility as white people to come and support our black members of our community, because for so long, 400 years of oppression has come and gone, and there hasn't been any real change. And I think that it's enough is enough, and it's really tiring to have black people on the forelines of all this. And I think that's our job to really take the brunt of this, because it is our problem that we created.
I'm out here for the Black Lives Matter movement. I want justice, peace, and reform.
Tensions between law enforcement and blacks have existed for nearly 400 years. Historians say the root cause of police brutality is in the origins of policing in the country. America was founded on the genocide of natives and the theft of their lands, and on the backs of Africans brought to the land of the slaves.
The country was founded on the labor of captive Africans, and founded on land stolen from natives, indigenous people. And so this has colored, no pun intended, the entire development of the political system, of the relationships between classes, groups of people, different waves of immigration. The whole thing is about white supremacy.
Across the country, blacks lived in fear of white militias armed with weapons who monitored their every move, attacked them, and killed them for the slightest provocation. They would come to be known as slave patrols. These organized armed white men were the first police force in America. They were created to monitor the enslaved black people, hunt down runaways, and suppress rebellions.
Those who did survive the horrors of the slave trade and were brought to what would become the U.S. were also subjected to the first form of organized policing in the South, known as the Slave Patrol. In case you missed it, the Slave Patrol and slave catchers were the first form of organized police in the South.
These slave patrols laid the foundation for centuries of violent and racist behavior towards black Americans. After the abolition of slavery in 1865, towards the end of the Civil War, slave patrols were replaced by modern police departments. But the same racist mentality continued to dominate the police force.
If you look at the whole concept of white supremacy and how that fits into the counterinsurgency on a historical basis, of course, the oldest terrorist organization in the United States, which is the Ku Klux Klan, that was a group that was founded right after the Civil War to inflict terror against the African people in the United States who had been newly freed from slavery and who were beginning to try to organize. And then as you move on into the 20th century and the civil rights movement began to develop, the Klan and other groups would work alongside the police, whether it was local police or whether it was sheriff's departments, and they would work together to inflict terror, to restrain the movement, the organizing against white supremacy.
Soon, Congress passed a battery of racist laws to govern the lives of blacks who were now supposedly free. Whenever black Americans protested against segregation and other racist practices, law enforcement officials were often called in.
There was this never, freedom was a chimera from the beginning. But what happened to the U.S., this is the great Achilles heel, or not-so-secret weapon, depending on how you look at it. The ruling class in the development of the United States had a unique situation where they could constantly use race.
Decades of legalized racial discrimination led to a massive revolt by blacks in the late 1940s, known as the Civil Rights Movement, which continued until the late 1960s. As the movement grew in size and influence, many of its leaders were either assassinated or thrown in jail.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Soon, a system of harsh policing, punitive welfare and mass incarceration replaced the old Jim Crow that had just been scrapped.
What happened at the end of this is that you couldn't just let it go as a system. You had to begin a new system of Jim Crow, which was the establishment of black codes, the basically reinstituting slavery by different means. Now, after the Civil Rights Movement, you have another massive shift, but the result is that there's a new Jim Crow, and that is the mass incarceration state.
Language of the unheard. Today, for millions of African Americans across the United States, the promised land is yet to materialize. They often live in the poorest areas and suffer the highest rates of unemployment. The latest data show that as U.S. businesses reopen following corona-related shutdowns, black people are once again being left out.
And the unemployment rate wasn't felt by all Americans. For black workers, the rate continued to rise in May as African Americans bear the brunt of the economic downturn brought on by the coronavirus.
African Americans have long outnumbered whites in U.S. prisons, even though they make up just 12% of the total population. They also receive longer and harsher sentences for the same crimes.
But in terms of criminal justice, what we have got to do is understand the system is broken, is racist. We invest in our young people in jobs and education, not more jails and incarceration. We end the war on drugs, which has disproportionately impacted African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans.
As evident by the death of George Floyd, blacks are more likely to be killed by police in routine interactions. To chant that Black Lives Matter is not just a demand that they are not taken, but to insist that they are equally valued. Until that happens, America will continue to see more riots and unrest.
The Kerner Report said it 60 years ago, and they said it's a white problem. It's our problem. It's white people's job to solve the inequalities of institutionalized racism. Not as individuals. That's the trouble. That's their ace in the hole, is that they use what is basically a class issue to stoke the race issue, and vice versa. That the ruling class would love to pretend that it is a black issue.
President Trump, whose polling numbers have plunged, is trying to frame himself as a law and order candidate for the November election. Richard Nixon won the presidency on the same platform in 1968, as the country was engulfed in unprecedented riots and violence.
Let us look at America. Let us listen to America to find the answer to that question. As we look at America, we see cities enveloped in smoke and flame. We hear sirens in the night. We see Americans dying on distant battlefields abroad. We see Americans hating each other, fighting each other, killing each other at home. And as we see and hear these things, millions of Americans cry out in anguish, did we come all this way for this?
American politics on the right has since been shaped by Nixon's appeal to white men who resented the civil rights movement. Republican leaders went on to weaponize racism to remain in power. Donald Trump has deployed this strategy from day one. But it's not 1968. Surveys show that voters approve of the protests and strongly disapprove of Trump's response. According to an NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, 4 in 5 registered voters feel things in the country are out of control.
That when Nixon was running for president in 1968, he was not the incumbent. He was running to become the incumbent president. Mr. Trump is the incumbent. And as an incumbent, he has a record, and that record is despised by many. For example, his terrible attempt to halt the pandemic, the unemployment numbers that are reaching levels not seen since the 1930s, and then his neo-fascist-like approach to protest against police brutality.
President Trump's call to dominate the streets brought out a barrage of criticism from current and former military leaders, including former Defense Secretary James Mattis and former Chief of Staff John Kelly.
As we speak, I am dispatching thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers, military personnel, and law enforcement officers to stop the rioting, looting, vandalism, assaults, and the wanton destruction of property.
Republican leaders have also found themselves struggling whether to stay loyal to the party or break with the president. Massachusetts Senator Mitt Romney and former Secretary of State Colin Powell have already said they will not vote for Trump this fall.
We have a Constitution, and we have to follow that Constitution, and the president has drifted away from it. And then I was deeply troubled by the way in which he was going around insulting everybody, insulting Gold Star mothers, insulting John McCain, insulting immigrants, and I'm the son of immigrants, insulting anybody who dared to speak against him. And that is dangerous for our democracy, it's dangerous for our country, and I think what we're seeing now, the most massive protest movement I have ever seen in my life, I think this suggests that the country is getting wise to this and we're not going to put up with it anymore.
Overall, more than 280 former senior American diplomats and military leaders have condemned Trump over his approach to the military. A number of current and former lawmakers have also broken with Trump. The president could expect even more defections as the election draws closer. How will this play out in November?
That there is a very significant and profound split at the top of the national security establishment of the United States concerning Mr. Trump and his proposal to implant the military in Washington, D.C.
Images of U.S. police officers using armored vehicles, firing tear gas and flash grenades to disperse protesters have prompted shock around the world. The militarization of the U.S. police, which experts say stems from years of military adventurism abroad, has turned American streets into literal war zones.
That the U.S. Pentagon, that is to say the U.S. so-called Department of Defense, supplies U.S. police departments with military materiel, including grenade launchers, bazookas, armored personnel carriers. I understand they even supply them with tanks. Now, this is very curious because U.S. protesters and demonstrators generally do not have any arms. They generally do not even throw rocks or bottles or have a slingshot. So why are police being armed to the teeth to confront peaceful protesters in the United States streets?
More than $5 billion in surplus military equipment tied to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been distributed to law enforcement agencies across the United States. Demands to defund the militarized police are being chanted by protesters throughout America.
Our commitment is to do what's necessary to keep every single member of our community safe and to tell the truth that the Minneapolis police are not doing that. Our commitment is to end our city's toxic relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department, to end policing as we know it, and to recreate systems of public safety that actually keep us safe.
But reform would be impossible without also challenging the profit motive that drives U.S. aggression overseas.
That if the United States government is allowed to run amok overseas, in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere, inevitably the U.S. government will run amok at home.
As long as Americans allow their government to devalue human lives elsewhere, they can only expect them to do the same at home.
The United States oftentimes trains police departments overseas, for example, the police department of Israel, that then uses roughhouse tactics against the Palestinians, and then those roughhouse tactics are exported back to the United States to be used against U.S. demonstrators. It's a circle devoid of virtue, and in fact, it's a circle that contains the seeds of brutality and destruction.
The case of George Floyd has exposed the United States to charges of hypocrisy from historic allies like the European Union, human rights groups, and rivals such as China and Russia. The rest of the world is paying attention to the turmoil in America and a president who has pledged military retribution against his fellow citizens.
We all watch in horror and consternation what's going on in the United States. It is a time to pull people together, but it is a time to listen. It is a time to learn what injustices continue despite progress over years and decades.
The U.S. government has terrorized many countries for so long. Now, the chickens have come home to roost. Millions of Americans are out on the streets demanding change.
We would like in the United States to see the United States government brought before the United Nations Human Rights Council because of massive human rights violations against U.S. citizens that you see unfolding in the streets of the United States as we speak. We're all facing the same foe. We're all facing the same enemy. And neither side, neither you or we, will be able to advance as long as one or the other is being repressed and oppressed and suppressed by the U.S. government.
It remains to be seen how a divided America will emerge from its centuries-old history of racism, inequality, and oppression.
Either America will destroy racism, or racism will destroy America.
American voters believe black people have the right to live. Good news? That's a start. Now it's time to put our money where our mouth is, just as soon as we take the slave owners off the money.